Nvidia trusted a $6.6 billion AI platform. It was leaking their projects to strangers. Somewhere between February and March 2025, an API endpoint inside Lovable's infrastructure was returning data it was never supposed to return. Not corrupted data, not random noise. Structured project data, organized, labeled, readable, the kind a competitor would pay for. Lovable called it a misconfiguration. Their own security disclosure used a different phrase: unintended data exposure across workspace boundaries. Those two descriptions are not the same thing. Lovable launched in late 2024 with a specific promise. You describe an app, it builds one. No developers, no infrastructure knowledge required. Full stack generation from a single prompt. The pitch worked. By early 2025, the platform had crossed 1.5 million users. Nvidia teams were building internal tools on it. Microsoft teams were prototyping on it. Enterprise accounts, real intellectual property, real internal roadmaps sitting inside a third-party AI builder most of their security teams had never audited. The valuation hit $6.6 billion. Nobody paused on that number. They should have. The standard assumption about enterprise AI tools, especially ones backed at that valuation, is that security scales with funding. More money, more infrastructure, more protection. That's the narrative the industry sells. Lovable's terms of service described workspace isolation as a foundational design principle. Each user's environment was supposed to be siloed. What you built, only you could see. The API said otherwise. A specific endpoint, accessible without elevated permissions, was returning project metadata from workspaces that were not the requesters: names, configurations, structural data, the architecture of what someone was building. Workspace isolation wasn't a feature. It was a claim. No credential theft, no social engineering, no sophisticated exploit chain. The endpoint was reachable with a standard authenticated session, meaning any Lovable user, on any plan, could potentially query project data from other users' workspaces. The authentication gate confirmed you were a user. It did not confirm you were that user's workspace. That distinction is the entire security model. It was missing. To understand what this exposed, you need to understand who was using the platform. Nvidia's internal teams were among the documented enterprise users. These are not casual experimenters. Nvidia's competitive advantage in 2025 is measured in nanometers and model architectures, the precise kind of technical detail that lives inside internal tooling projects. When you build a tool to manage GPU allocation or to interface with proprietary training pipelines, the tool's structure reveals the pipeline. The project data wasn't just names and labels, it was a blueprint of what the company was working on. The flaw was first documented by security researcher Barak Erez in March 2025. His disclosure was methodical. He identified the vulnerable endpoint, demonstrated cross-workspace data retrieval, and reported it through responsible disclosure channels. What his report described was not a theoretical attack surface. It was a functioning one. According to the disclosure, the endpoint was returning data consistently across multiple test cases for workspaces he did not own. The behavior was reproducible. That word, reproducible, is important. It means this wasn't a one-time anomaly triggered by unusual conditions. It was baked into how the endpoint behaved by default. The language companies use in security disclosures is rarely accidental. Misconfiguration implies a server setting was toggled wrong, a checkbox unchecked, something an engineer fixed in 20 minutes. It carries no implication of design failure, no implication of structural oversight. Unintended data exposure across workspace boundaries describes something different. It describes a system that was moving data between users and doing it without awareness that this was happening. One of those is a typo. The other is an architecture problem. Lovable used both phrases in the same disclosure. Consider the Nvidia employee who opened Lovable on a Tuesday afternoon to prototype an internal dashboard. They authenticated with a work email. They named the project something descriptive, because that's how internal tools get named. They included configuration details, API references, integration logic. They were not doing anything reckless. They were using a $6.6 billion enterprise-grade platform exactly as advertised. They had no mechanism to know that their project structure was queryable by someone 3 time zones away with a standard account and a curious disposition. The liability was invisible to the person carrying it. Here's where the timeline matters. Lovable's enterprise push, the active recruitment of companies like Nvidia and Microsoft Teams, the positioning as a serious infrastructure layer for internal tooling, was happening at the same time this vulnerability existed. They were signing enterprise accounts while the workspace isolation they were selling didn't work. The flaw wasn't discovered after growth. It wasn't a scaling problem that emerged when load increased. According to the technical disclosure, the endpoint structure suggests this was present from the platform's early architecture, meaning it predates the enterprise push. They were building the funnel before they'd sealed the container. This is the part the enterprise security conversation consistently misses. The attack surface isn't always inside the company. It's inside the tools the company uses. Nvidia could have had perfect internal security hygiene, zero trust architecture, rotated credentials, multi-factor everything, and still been exposed through a third-party SaaS platform their team adopted without a full security review. This is not a hypothetical risk category. Security professionals call it third-party supply chain exposure. In March 2025, it had a specific URL. After the disclosure was filed, Lovable patched the endpoint. They confirmed the fix. They issued a statement describing the event as resolved. Standard incident response. Textbook. What they did not publish. How long the endpoint had been active in its vulnerable state. No timeline. No window of exposure. No statement on whether access logs had been reviewed for anomalous cross-workspace queries before the patch was applied. The disclosure confirmed the flaw existed. It did not confirm no one had used it. Those are 2 very different assurances. Only one was given. The $6.6 billion valuation is not decoration, it's context. At that number, Lovable was being priced as infrastructure, not a startup product, not a prototype environment, but a foundational layer for enterprise application development. Institutional investors were pricing in the assumption that enterprise clients would embed Lovable into their workflows long-term. That pricing assumes the product is enterprise-ready. Enterprise-ready has a specific meaning in security: audited, isolated, compliant with standards like SOC 2. Lovable's public documentation at the time of the vulnerability did not include published SOC 2 certification. The valuation implied a maturity the architecture hadn't reached. The AI application builder market in 2025 is a land grab. First-mover advantage is real. Platforms that capture enterprise workflows early, even imperfectly, tend to retain them. Switching costs are high. Integrations multiply. Dependencies deepen. The incentive structure rewards speed. Thorough security architecture is slow. Penetration testing, access control audits, cross-workspace isolation validation, these are not fast processes. In a market where the window to acquire Nvidia and Microsoft Teams is measured in quarters, not years, the calculus is visible. Move fast, fix later. The Nvidia employee didn't know they were the fix later part. Internal enterprise security teams do perform vendor assessments, procurement checklists, self-reported questionnaires, sometimes third-party audits, but there's a class of tool adoption that bypasses this process entirely. Developers discover platforms. They use them for small projects. Small projects become medium projects. Medium projects contain real data. By the time enterprise security reviews the tool, it's already embedded, and the political cost of removing it is higher than the perceived risk of keeping it. This is documented behavior. Security researchers call it shadow ET. Lovable's own user growth numbers suggest this is exactly how it spread inside enterprise teams. Not through procurement, through engineers who found something that worked. The question that never appeared in Lovable's disclosure is the one that matters most. Who queried that endpoint between its creation and its patch? Access logs exist. Every cloud infrastructure provider generates them by default. The data on who called that endpoint, when, and with what parameters. That data existed the moment Erez filed his report. It existed before the patch. It exists now. Lovable has not published it. They are not legally required to. In most jurisdictions, disclosure obligations around data breaches require proof of confirmed unauthorized access, not proof that unauthorized access was possible. The gap between possible and confirmed is where this story still lives. Here is what the public record actually contains. A reproducible vulnerability, confirmed by the researcher, confirmed by the company. An unknown exposure window, no published log review, no breach notification to affected enterprise users. A patch, a statement, a closed ticket. Nvidia's teams may never have been directly accessed through this flaw, or they may have been, and no one can say with certainty. That ambiguity is the product of how Lovable managed disclosure. It was a choice. The AI builder category is growing faster than enterprise security frameworks can track it. In 2024 alone, platforms like Lovable, Bolt, and Cursor collectively onboarded millions of users, a significant portion of them inside companies with sensitive intellectual property. The regulatory infrastructure governing what these platforms must disclose, how quickly and to whom, has not caught up. GDPR covers personal data. SOC 2 is voluntary. CCPA has specific carve-outs. There is no framework that currently mandates that a platform like Lovable tell Nvidia, your project data was accessible to other users. Here is the window. Here are the log entries. Here is what we found. No one required them to, so they didn't. The $6.6 billion valuation is still intact. Lovable is still onboarding enterprise users. Nvidia and Microsoft Teams are still listed as part of the platform's user base. The endpoint was patched. The logs were never published. The exposure window is unknown. And every enterprise team that adopted Lovable through shadow IT, without a security review, without a procurement audit, without a signed data processing agreement, is still embedded in the platform. The flaw was fixed. The conditions that created it were not. The most dangerous vulnerabilities aren't the ones attackers exploit. They're the ones that close quietly before anyone checks the logs. This is Redacted Chapter. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.